Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Academia Lux Borealis, the Alaska Lodge of Research and Education. This morning, our presentation is Charity, Sacrifice, and Fasting, the Spiritual Architecture of the Soul. As Freemasons, we meet on the level to discuss the spiritual architecture of the human soul. In our rituals, we are taught that Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. Today we will pull back the veil to examine three essential working tools of spiritual life: charity, sacrifice, and fasting. While the world sees these as mere social or religious obligations, the speculative Mason may see them as the very means by which we subdue our passions and improve ourselves. These are the instruments by which we work the ashlar, transitioning from operative labor to speculative light. These three practices were not chosen arbitrarily. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 served as the inspiration for this paper. This passage functions as a profound ethical mirror for Freemasons, reminding us that philanthropy and outward acts of benevolence become spiritually hollow when divorced from genuine love. While Masonry places immense emphasis on charity as a foundational pillar of the institution, the Apostle Paul admonishes that even if one bestows their goods to feed the poor, and bestows all their goods to feed the poor, without agape, the selfless sacrificial love defined in this paper, it profits nothing. For a Mason, this passage reframes charity as not merely as a financial contribution or a kind duty fulfilled within a lodge, but as an internal transformation characterized by patience, kindness, humility, and grace. It challenges brethren to ensure that their charitable works are driven by a sincere heart rather than a desire for recognition, emphasizing that while material relief is vital, the greatest, most enduring gift a Mason can offer the world is unconditional love. Yet our craft honors many virtues: truth, fortitude, temperance, and prudence. Charity, sacrifice, and fasting occupy a unique position because they are not merely attitudes to be held, but actions to be performed. They are verbs before they are announced. Moreover, they are universally recognized across spiritual traditions. Islam practices zakat, or charity, and Ramadan, or fasting. Judaism observes Tzedakah and Yom Kippur. Buddhism embraces dana, or generosity, and ascetic discipline. Freemasonry, drawing upon the universal moral law, identifies these not as sectarian obligations, but as perennial instruments for the soul's refinement. What distinguishes them from other virtues is their transformative character. They do not merely describe a state of being, but actively reshape the inner life of the practitioner. Throughout this presentation, we will have questions for reflection and discussion. In this case, I'm going to ask some questions, and I'll let you all contemplate them as we go through this presentation, and then afterwards we'll go ahead and open up to question and answer. Now, if Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory, what dangers arise when we read allegory too literally versus too loosely? Second question: why might these three practices be selected over other spiritual disciplines? What distinguishes them from contemplation, pilgrimage, or study? And how does the metaphor of working tools shape our understanding of spiritual development as labor versus revelation? Having introduced that these three practices form the foundation of spiritual labor, we must first understand the nature of the tool most frequently misunderstood in our modern age. Of all the working tools of the soul, charity bears the heaviest burden of misinterpretation. The world reduces it to philanthropy. We shall see that it is actually theosis, the deification of the giver through participation in divine love. With this foundation laid, we will now turn to examine charity as in its true metaphysical depth. Charity is frequently misunderstood in the modern era as philanthropy, the secular distribution of excess resources. However, the biblical concept of charity, rooted in the Greek agape and the Hebrew tzedakah, is a spiritual alignment with the nature of God. Tzedakah derives from Tzedek, Hebrew for righteousness or justice, suggesting that charity is not generosity but obligation, a restoration of divine order. This is a critical distinction from the Greek eleemosine, mercy or pity, which frames giving as an act of compassion towards the unfortunate. Tzedakah, by contrast, frames giving as an act of justice, or returning what has been a divine provision. The poor are not recipients of our mercy, they are claimants on God's blessing. This shifts the entire psychology of giving. We do not give because we are noble, we give because it is our sacred duty. It is essential to distinguish agape from other Greek words for love. Eros is romantic or passionate love, love that seeks fulfillment. Philia is brotherly affection, love born of shared experience and mutual regard. Agape, however, is self-giving love, love that seeks the good of the other without expectation of return. It is agape that underlies charitas, and it is agape that makes charity uniquely demanding, for it requires the donor to seek nothing, not gratitude, not recognition, not even the satisfaction of having helped. True Masonic relief, or charity, is both an act of the Hebrew tzedakah and the Greek agape, is the fulfillment of our sacred obligations. So some questions for reflection. If nothing we possess is truly ours, does ownership merely become stewardship? And what responsibilities does that impose upon the Mason? Can charity with expectation of return still be considered spiritual charity, or does the motive corrupt the act entirely? And how might Masonic anonymity in giving protect against both the ego of the giver and the shame of the receiver? Understanding charity as justice rather than generosity changes how we approach the act itself. Yet, even with the correct theological framework, we still distort the execution. For it is possible to give rightly while thinking wrongly, perform the external action correctly while harboring corruption within the heart. This brings us to the question of interior disposition, not merely what we give, but how and why we give. The outer work must be matched by the inner work. With this in mind, let us now consider the interior landscape of what true charity takes root or fails to grow. In the Christian tradition, charity is not just an act, it is the primary attribute of God. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, in ancient Greek is written, Ho theos agape estin, which more precisely is rendered, quote, God is love, unquote. This is not merely an attribute of God, something God possesses, but a statement about God's very essence. God does not merely practice love, God is love. This ontological distinction matters profoundly. If love is something God does, then charity is optional even for the divine. If love is what God is, then to love is to participate in the divine nature itself. Therefore, when a person engages in charity, they are not merely performing a good deed, they are participating in the life of God. Biblically, the spiritual significance of charity is found in the recognition that nothing we possess is truly ours. Psalm chapter 4, verse 1 reminds us, quote, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, unquote. When we give, we are returning a portion of God's providence to his creation. For Masons, charity is not merely the act of dropping a coin into a hat. It is the state of the heart. The heart of a Mason is one that has been expanded to encompass the whole of humanity. We are reminded in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, without charity, we are but noise. Now, if love is God's essence rather than merely his attribute, what does that imply about the spiritual stakes of refusing to give? And how might our understanding of charity change if we treated every possession as a loan rather than an entitlement? And when Paul says, without charity we are but noise, is he but describing a deficiency in volume or in substance? What of the heart that gives in secret? If charity is participation in divine nature, how do we ensure that our participation remains pure and untainted in the very ego we are seek to transcend? The external act we may conceal from the world, yet the internal theater of the soul plays on regardless. The external act may be concealed from the world, yet the internal theater of the soul plays on regardless. We must therefore descend further into inward to consider how the giver can hide from himself as well as others. For the most dangerous audience for our charity is not the public square, it is our own self-regarding consciousness. This leads us inevitably to the question of interior silence. Biblically, the Mason looks to Matthew chapter 6, verse 3, quote, "But when thou dost alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth," unquote. This aligns perfectly with our Masonic instruction to practice secrecy and silence. However, we must distinguish between two forms of hiddenness. Up here, I can't blow up any more than what I'm giving you here. Yeah. If you click on the, I should have it pinned, but if you click on it, you should be able to go into your. Yes, if you do it that way, Pierre, that's the way you'll get it. Otherwise, you're doing the toggle view. So if you go down towards the bottom of your screen where you have the toolbar, click the. Okay, right on. Sorry about that. Where was I? Biblically, the Mason looks to Matthew chapter 6, verse 3. Quote, "But when thou dost alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth." Unquote. This aligns perfectly with our Masonic instruction to practice secrecy and silence. However, we must distinguish between two forms of hiddenness. The first is external secrecy, the concealment of charitable acts from public view. This is relatively straightforward and corresponds to the Masonic virtue of silence. The second is internal silence, the concealment of charitable acts for one's own ego. This is far more difficult. A man can hide his charity from the world and can still privately congratulate himself on his generosity. True hiddenness requires mortification at both levels. The external, namely not by announcing it, and the internal, not by congratulating oneself. The spiritual efficacy of charity depends entirely on the heart of the giver. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 through 4, Jesus warns against performing charity for public recognition. Quote, "Take heed of what ye do, not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore when thou dost thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou dost alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly." Unquote. This hiddenness is essential. Spiritual charity requires a mortification of self. If we give to feel superior or to be seen as generous, we have received our reward in full. Namely, we've received the praise of men, and we've gained nothing in spirit. True charity must be a pure gift, one that expects nothing in return, mirroring the grace of God, which is given freely to, quote, the just and unjust alike. A Mason's charity is spiritual when it is anonymous. By giving in secret, a Mason ensures that his ego is not fed by the praise of the world. He recognizes that he is not the source of the gift, but merely the steward of the great architect's bounty. Yet we should also acknowledge genuine tension. Anonymous charity removes accountability. In Lodge, we operate with mutual oversight. Each brother is accountable to the others. Should there be a mechanism for transparency in charitable works, even if not public? The tradition of spiritual charity suggests that accountability belongs to God alone, but the pragmatic reality of human fallibility suggests that some oversight prevents both negligence and self-deception. In Lodge, we meet on the level because we acknowledge we brought nothing into this world, and there's certainly nothing we can carry out of it. If the greatest reward is the praise of men, what constitutes the reward of hidden charity when no one knows, including yourself? Does secret charity risk enabling abuse or exploitation by removing oversight, or does it preserve the purity of intention more effectively? And can a person achieve true anonymity from their ego, or is their self-awareness itself a form of vanity that can never fully be escaped? Thus, having that we've explored the inner dimensions of charity, we arrive at its mystical culmination. When charity is practiced in true hiddenness, with both the external and internal audiences silenced, we discover something astonishing. The giver, the giving, and the recipient cease to be separate entities. Instead, they converge into a single sacramental moment wherein the barrier between the human and the divine grows thin. For when we truly see the other, we encounter the one who made him. This transforms charity from ethics into ontology, from a moral duty into a means of communion. Now let us consider this higher mystery, charity as a divine encounter. Charity is the cement that binds our fraternity. It is the spiritual recognition that every man is a companion to the prince and a fellow to the beggar. When we practice charity, we are performing a ritual of at-one-ment, a word that captures both reconciliation, or atonement, with God and the unity of being one with humanity. This transforms charity from a vertical act, human to divine, into a horizontal act, human to human, while maintaining that the horizontal act itself is a form of the vertical. To serve the brother is to serve the great architect, proving that the mystic tie that binds us is stronger than the divisions of the profane world. There is a mystical dimension to charity where the recipient becomes a sacrament of the divine. In Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, Jesus does not mince words when speaking to the principle of relief. Quote, "And the king shall answer and say to them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of my brethren, ye have done unto me." Unquote. From a spiritual perspective, the poor are not problems to be solved, but rather the very location where we find God. Charity then becomes a form of worship, a way to love the Creator by loving the creature. Here, however, a critical nuance is required. The poor do not exist for the spiritual benefit of the giver. Their dignity is intrinsic, not instrumental. To treat the poor merely as opportunities for sanctification is to repeat the very objectification of that charity is meant to overcome. The sacramental dimension of charity means that God is present in the encounter, not that the poor person is a tool for growth. The distinction is subtle but essential. We find God through them because God already dwells within them, not because they serve our spiritual program. This awareness guards against the savior complex that can masquerade as charity while actually serving the ego of the donor. So for reflection, if the poor are the very location where we find God, does this mean God is absent from places of wealth, or merely less accessible there? Indeed. Could it be that there's tends to be more noise in the jingle of coin? Okay. So what distinguishes seeing someone as a sacrament of the divine versus seeing them as a means to one's own spiritual advancement? Okay, I do have one question, then I'll get to John Bishop. Nick, um, so we recognize that there might be, I guess you could say, a deficit in someone of wealth. Is there a form of charity that we could extend to someone that believes that, or that may have the means that doesn't necessarily require traditional charity, so to speak? Indeed. John Bishop. I follow, John. Um, Now, charity, properly understood, is not merely one virtue among many, it is the very nature of the divine manifest through human hands. But if charity flows from our nature as participants in God's love, where does it end? The answer lies in the companion virtue of sacrifice. For charity demands payment, and that payment is not in coins, but in and of ourselves. What we give in charity costs us something. We part with possessions, time, and comfort. Yet the cost of charity pales beside the cost of true sacrifice, which demands not merely what we have, but who we are. We have seen charity as an outward flow. Now we must turn to sacrifice as an inward surrender. Sacrifice is perhaps the most misunderstood spiritual practice in a consumerist culture. We tend to view sacrifice as a loss, but in the biblical sense, sacrificum, from sacer and facer, means to make holy. In our speculative labor, the altar is not a place for animal offerings, but the site where we offer up our own vices and superfluities. In the Old Testament, sacrifice involved the ritual of offering animals or crops. These were symbolic representations of people's dependencies on God. However, the prophets began to shift the focus from the ritual to the internal state of the soul. This shift was not arbitrary. It arose from a crisis. The prophets observed the ritual of sacrifice become a substitute for genuine moral transformation. People offered animals while exploiting their neighbors. Hosea declared, quote, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," unquote. The prophetic critique is not that sacrifice was wrong, but that it had become insufficient. A hollow performance detached from the very holiness it was meant to enact. The shift from external to the internal was, therefore, a rescue of sacrifice from its own corruption. The spiritual aspect of sacrifice is best symbolized by the common gavel. We use it to break off the corners of rough stones, the better to fit them for the builder's use. This is an act of sacrifice, to become a living stone in that spiritual temple not made with hands. We must sacrifice our rough edges, our prejudices, our anger, our selfish ambitions. Psalm chapter 51, verse 17 declares, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, will thou not despise," unquote. This psalm arises from the confrontation with moral failure and provides pivotal spiritual insight. God does not need our possessions. He desires our will. For our Mason, the broken heart is one that has been opened to the light, having sacrificed the hard shell of ego. In it we learn that sacrifice begins with recognition, not merely willpower. This breaking should not be romanticized. A contrite heart is not merely emotional sadness. It is the structural collapse of ego defenses. The hard shell protects us from the pain, yes, but it also shields us from transformation. Sacrifice demands that we willingly enter the vulnerability that those defense mechanisms were built to prevent. This is terrifying work because it leaves us exposed. It is precisely this exposure that the light enters. Some questions for reflection. If the prophetic shift moved a sacrifice from external ritual to internal disposition, can external ritual still hold value, or is it merely vestigial? Does a broken heart represent destruction, expansion, or both? How can we distinguish genuine contrition through spiritual self-pity? And what defenses has the ego constructed in our own life that would need to be sacrificed for further transformation? The broken heart is not the end of sacrifice. It is the beginning. Once the shell is cracked, what follows is not cessation, but continuation. The initial breaking must become an ongoing posture. Where the old covenant demanded the slaughter of beasts, the new covenant demands the daily surrender of self. This is no longer occasional ceremony, but constant orientation. From this realization emerges a profound paradox. The living sacrifice is more demanding than the ritual one. Whereas the priest's work ends, the blood is poured. The Christian sacrifice never concludes. It breathes, walks, and endures. We must now examine the nature of this living, breathing surrender. Spiritual sacrifice is an act of surrendering what is ours, our time, our preferences, our autonomy, for the sake of the other. In the New Testament, this reaches its zenith in the living sacrifice. Romans 12:1 urges, quote, "I beseech ye therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service." Unquote. In our modern age, the most profound sacrifice a brother can make is his time. When we dedicate our time to the service of a distressed brother or the betterment of our community, we are practicing this living sacrifice. A living sacrifice is far more difficult than a ritual one. Ritual sacrifice performed once and completed. A living sacrifice must be offered moment by moment. It requires a constant, ongoing decision to align one's life with divine values, rather than personal impulses. It is the dying self that Jesus speaks of when he says, quote, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me," unquote. It is worth considering which form of sacrifice is more demanding, the single heroic act or the daily unspectacular surrender. Martyrdom captures the imagination because it is dramatic and complete. But the living sacrifice asks something arguably harder. To die to self while remaining alive, to continue functioning in the world while continually subordinating the will. Hiram Abiff sacrifices life rather than forfeit his integrity, a single defining act. But the Mason who rises each morning and chooses integrity over expediency, day after unremarkable day, participates in the same sacrifice spread across a lifetime. True Masonic sacrifice is the submission of the individual will to the divine will. Just as the master architect of the temple, Hiram Abiff, sacrifices life rather than forfeit his integrity. The Mason is taught that the character is more valuable than life itself. And this, my brethren, is the sublime degree of spiritual sacrifice. So, some more questions for reflection. Is it easier to sacrifice once, through martyrdom, or repeatedly, through daily surrender? And why might the latter prove more spiritually transformative? If God desires our will more than our possessions, what would happen if we offered Him our will alone but withheld our resources? And yes, couldn't you say that committing yourself to a lifetime of sacrifice becomes something that we would create as being habitual and would actually have larger impacts, say death by 1,000 cuts, than say death by a singular cut? Should only happen once? Well, I agree, but are we? But if we try to strike the ashlar once just to remove all the pieces, does that actually truly fit that ashlar for the temple? For some, it may. Indeed. Indeed. presentation's still going. I am I am about halfway through. Terry. Thank you. So, in the last question to kind of consider whether you want to do so out loud or just take it to heart, the living sacrifice must be continually renewed. In what moments of daily life is this renewal most difficult, and why? So, living sacrifice presents a challenge that ritual sacrifice did not, the perpetual nature of the demand. When sacrifice must be repeated indefinitely, resistance becomes inevitable. The human psyche seeks resolution, closure, completion. Yet, spiritual sacrifice refuses all three. Here we encounter another paradox. What seems like loss becomes gain, and what appears as diminishment reveals abundance. The logic of the kingdom inverts the economy of the world. We have seen sacrifice as surrender. Now we must witness its counterintuitive harvest, gain through loss, life through death, abundance through subtraction. Excuse me. The spiritual logic of sacrifice is paradoxical. We gain by giving away. When we sacrifice a selfish desire, we create space in the soul for divine grace. Sacrifice clears the clutter of the ego. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 22, the sacrifice was never about the death of a son. It was about the total surrender of Abraham's future and security into the hands of God. Once the internal sacrifice was complete, the physical sacrifice was no longer necessary. This account has been interpreted in multiple ways throughout history, as a test of obedience, as a demonstration of faith, as a prefiguration of divine sacrifice. The interpretation most fruitful for the Masonic reader emphasizes the interior dimension. God did not require Isaac. God required Abraham's willingness to hold nothing back. The ram caught in the thicket was not a substitute for Isaac, but a sign that Abraham's surrender had been accepted. The physical act became necessary not because it was unimportant, but because the spiritual reality it symbolized had been fulfilled. Now, if internal surrender makes physical sacrifice necessary, what does that mean? All external sacrifice is ultimately secondary to internal disposition. And can gain through loss occur when the loss being genuinely felt, without the loss being genuinely felt, or must something truly be relinquished for the gain to be real? And what would constitute a failed sacrifice? One where the appearance of surrender was present, but the substance was absent? Abraham's story teaches us that surrender precedes substitution, that the heart's surrender validates or invalidates the offering itself. But sacrifice is not merely abstract. It has taken historical form, embodied in men who gave more than their possessions, more than their lives, more even than their names. We move from theology to history, from the universal principle of witness to particular witness. The Templars, those warrior monks whose seal depicts two riders on one horse, stands as one of history's most vivid exemplars of sacrificial commitment. Their story, while debated by scholars, offers our brethren a living mirror for examining our own vows. Now let us consider sacrifice as it was lived, not merely theorized. The Templars began in 1118 AD as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The original seal, the two knights riding a single horse, remains one of the most enduring symbols of sacrifice. Now scholars debate whether this depicted the poverty of the early order or the sharing of amount on campaign, but for Masons it signifies the sacrifice of autonomy. It is worth noting that the scholarly debate enriches the symbol, whether the seal represents permanent poverty or practical solidarity. Both readings point to the same Masonic truth, the surrender of individual sufficiency for the sake of a higher calling. To join the Templars was to commit social suicide. A knight sacrificed his title, his lands, his family, even his own will. Much like our Masonic emphasis on the virtues of silence and circumspection, the Templars embraced the rule of silence and were forbidden from idle talk. They ate in absolute silence, listening to Scripture, sacrificing human desire for social vanity to maintain a focus on the great architect. Over nearly 2 centuries, thousands of Templars perished in battle or through martyrdom. The most poignant historical mirror to our Hiram Abiff occurred at the siege of Safed in 1266. According to the Chronicle of Ernol, a garrison of Templars was captured and offered their lives if they would deny their faith. Every single one chose sacrifice over the betrayal of their integrity, over the betrayal of their faith. This was not merely a military feat. It was a testament to their faith and their integrity, a sublime degree of character that values truth over itself, over life itself. It is worth observing in the interest of historical honesty that sacrifice does not guarantee preservation. The same Templar order that produced these martyrs was destroyed not by Saracens but by a Christian king, Philip IV of France, in 1307. The brothers who sacrificed everything for their vows were ultimately betrayed by the very institutions they served. This sobering fact does not diminish the nobility of their sacrifice. Rather, it underscores that spiritual sacrifice is not transactional. We do not sacrifice in order to secure outcomes. We sacrifice because it is right. The Templar's fate reminds us that integrity may cost us everything the world values, and that this is not evidence of failure but of fidelity. Some questions for reflection and discussion if you care to. If joining the Templars required social suicide, what forms of social death might modern Masons experience through their commitments? The Templars were destroyed by those they served. What does this suggest about the relationship between institutional loyalty and spiritual integrity when institutions betray their own principles? If sacrifice does not guarantee earthly preservation, what does it guarantee, if anything? All right, so the Templar sacrifice was costly, but their discipline was equally remarkable. They did not merely endure hardship. They structured their entire existence around a regimen that tempered body and spirit simultaneously. Here we encounter fasting, our third spiritual pillar. For sacrifice cannot reach its fullness without the discipline that restrains the flesh. Fasting is not punishment but preparation, the sharpening of the blade that the sacrifice wields. Where sacrifice surrenders will, fasting masters the appetites. Together they form united fronts against the tyranny of self-indulgence. Let us now examine this third tool. Fast is liberation. Fasting is the voluntary deprivation of food or other comforts for a spiritual purpose. It is not a diet, it is a spiritual weapon. While Freemasonry does not mandate specific fasts, The spiritual principle of temperance, one of our 4 cardinal virtues, is deeply rooted in the practice of fasting. Though our craft does not prescribe fasting, it draws upon a discipline recognized across virtually all spiritual traditions. Islam observes the month of Ramadan. Judaism marks Yom Kippur and other fasting days. Buddhist monks eat only before noon. Hindu tradition includes Vrata, or vows of fasting. This universality suggests that fasting addresses some fundamental about the human condition, the tyranny of appetite and the need for its deliberate subordination. If fasting is practiced across so many diverse traditions, why does it universally suggest a natural law principle, or does it universally suggest a natural law principle, or merely cultural convergence? How does Masonic temperance relate to fasting? Does it imply abstinence, moderation, or something more dynamic? If the body's appetites are loud, what does silence beneath them reveal when we quiet them? Fasting's universality points to something deeper than cultural preference. It reveals a structural necessity of spiritual life. Appetite dominates the unexamined life, rendering the spirit captive to bodily demands. But the human being is more than hunger, more than thirst, more than comfort-seeking machinery. There exists beneath the clamor of the senses a quieter voice, the voice of spirit, waiting to be heard. Fasting creates the conditions for that hearing. It is not merely denial, but attunement, the deliberate silencing of the lower frequencies so the higher ones may emerge. To understand this, we must distinguish the kinds of hunger we experience, recognizing that each corresponds to a different realm of being. In the natural state, the body's appetites appear loud. We are constantly seeking to satisfy hunger, thirst, and comfort. Fasting serves to quiet the body so the voice of the spirit can be heard. Fasting is the voluntary shutting down of the physical appetites to allow the spiritual senses to sharpen. It is important to distinguish between physiological hunger and spiritual hunger. Physiological hunger is a biological signal. Fuel is low, replenishment's needed. Spiritual hunger is an existential longing, the soul's recognition that material sustenance is insufficient for its deepest needs. Fasting addresses both simultaneously. By intensifying physiological hunger, it awakens spiritual hunger. The gnawing emptiness in the stomach becomes a metaphor for the deeper emptiness that only God can fill. This is why fasting is not merely physical discipline, but a form of spiritual listening. In the Bible, fasting was always a precursor to receiving light. Moses fasted before receiving the law. Elijah fasted before hearing the still small voice. For the Mason, fasting is an exercise in self-mastery. If a man cannot control his appetite for food or drink, how can we hope to control his tongue, his temper, his lusts? Fasting is the working tool of the will. When Jesus fasted for 40 days in the wilderness, he responded to the tempter saying, quote, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Unquote. Fasting teaches the soul that its primary sustenance is not material, but spiritual. By occasionally denying the body, the Mason reminds himself that he is a spiritual being inhabiting a physical frame. Now let's reflect on some questions. Can a person master appetite for food while remaining enslaved to ambition, anger, or pride? Or does true mastery require holistic surrender? What is the relationship between the physiological emptiness and spiritual receptivity? Does one cause the other or merely accompany it? And lastly, if fasting reveals the soul's hunger, what happens when hunger is revealed but not satisfied? Fasting begins with the body but extends far beyond it. The appetite we learn to restrain in the stomach can train us to restrain our hungers. The hunger for speech, for attention, for dominance. The tongue has its own cravings. often more destructive than those of the palate. If the body's discipline prepares the ground for the spirit's movement, the discipline of speech cultivates the soil. We speak less not to accumulate eloquence, but to conserve energy for intercession. Let us consider how fasting, in its various forms, becomes a proper means of prayer itself, a bodily petition rising towards heaven. Throughout the Bible, fasting is linked to intense prayer and intercession. When Nehemiah heard of the ruin of Jerusalem, he sat down and wept, fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Spiritually, fasting is a way of putting your body where your mouth is. It signals the desperation of God's intervention. It humbles the soul. Psalm 35:13 says, I humbled myself with fasting. By making the body weak, the spirit is forced to rely on God's Spirit. In Masonry, we are encouraged to practice a fast of the tongue. Silence and circumspection is a form of spiritual fasting. By refraining from gossip, slander, or idle talk, we conserve our spiritual energy. James 1:26 warns that if a man, quote, bridleth not his tongue, this man's religion is in vain, unquote. But we should consider what constitutes idle talk. Not all speech is idle. Some speech is necessary. The correction of error, the defense of the innocent, the encouragement of the faint. The fast of the tongue does not prohibit speech that serves truth or mercy. Rather, it targets speech that serves the ego, boasting, gossip, flattery, complaint. The distinction is not between speech and silence, but between profitable speech and wasteful speech. A Mason who remains silent when he should speak has not fasted wisely. He has abandoned duty under the guise of discipline. Fasting in this broader sense is the circumscribing our desires and keeping our passions within due bounds. In the discipline of the compass, ensuring that the Spirit remains the master of the house. Let's reflect. Does a fast of the tongue risk enabling harmful silence when speech is morally required, or does it primarily curb unnecessary speech? How can a Mason distinguish between speech that serves the ego and speech that serves the lodge? If fasting is linked to intercession, can fasting without prayer still be spiritually effective, or does it become mere physical discipline? Alas, fasting that remains private risks becoming self-absorbed. A man may fast, pray, and silence his tongue, yet continue to exploit his neighbor. Such fasting is not merely ineffective, it is offensive. The prophet Isaiah thundered against precisely this contradiction. The fast coexists with injustice. This introduces a final crucial qualification. Fasting without justice is not merely incomplete, it is hollow. The inward discipline must flower onward into social action. Let us now consider the true fast, its demands on us, and how it integrates charity, sacrifice, and fasting into a coherent whole. The spiritual dangers of fasting are similar to those of charity, pride, and legalism. In Isaiah 58, God rebukes those who fast while continuing to exploit their workers and quarrel. The true fast that God chooses is one that links personal discipline to social justice. Now from Isaiah 58, verse 6 and 7. Quote, Is not this fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and yet ye break every yoke? Is not to deal thy bread to the hungry, that thou bring the poor that are cast out of thy house? When thou seest the naked, thou cover him, and thou hide thyself from thine own flesh. Unquote. This passage carries a severe warning. Fasting divorced from justice is not merely insufficient, it is offensive to God. The Israelites fasted and wondered why God did not respond. God's answer was devastating. Their fasting was hollow because it coexisted with exploitation. This parallels Jesus' condemnation of those who tithe meticulously while neglecting justice, mercy, and faith. from Matthew 23:23, quote, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, and mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and to not leave the other undone." Unquote. Here we see the integration of three themes. Fasting, or self-denial, must lead to charity, or loving thy neighbor. And both are underpinned by sacrifice, making the life holy. A fast that does not produce generosity is not a fast, it is a diet. A fast that does not soften the heart towards the suffering of others is not spiritual discipline, but spiritual theater. This connects directly to the lessons in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 against performing charity for recognition. The same ego that corrupts charity can corrupt fasting. The Pharisee who fasts twice a week and thanks God that he is not like other men, example in Luke 18 verse 12, has turned a spiritual weapon into an instrument of pride. The true fast from Isaiah 58 guards against this by insisting that fasting always flows into outward action. So, questions for reflection. If fasting without justice is condemned, is justice without fasting equally insufficient? Or are they asymmetrically related? What distinguishes a fast that loosens chains from a fast that merely improves the faster's mood or productivity? Can a person be spiritually advanced in fasting while materially exploitive? What does Isaiah 58 imply about such a person standing before God? Isaiah's vision of the true fast brings us to a critical juncture, the point where theory meets practice, where spiritual principle confronts historical embodiment. We have spoken of fasting in the abstract. Let us now examine how it was lived by communities that took these demands seriously. The Cistercians and Templars did not merely preach temperance, they organized their entire existence around it. Their rules provide a concrete window into what disciplined life looked like when not constrained to Sunday worship or seasonal observances. Let us turn to the historic record of these orders and the rhythms they kept. The spiritual foundation of the Templars was provided by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and the Cistercian order. Their fasting was not about starvation, but about temperance, ensuring that the spirit was the master of the house. The Lenten life and rules of the Knights Templar were derived from the Cistercian rule mandated a life of rigorous physical discipline. Both orders observed a perpetual fast. Meat was allowed only 3 times a week. On all other days, the warriors of the temple lived on pottage, bread, and water. Likewise, both orders observed the fast of the seasons, fasted from All Saints' Day, which was November 1st, until Easter. The Knights practiced a heightened fast, often eating only 1 meal a day. This was not a punishment, but a tuning of the instrument. They believed a body burdened by heavy food and wine was akin to a rough ashlar, unfit for the spiritual warfare they were called to wage. By fasting, they refined their focus, ensuring they remained watchful and sober. It should be noted that these rules served a dual purpose, unique to military and monastic orders: spiritual discipline and combat readiness. A knight heavy with food and wine was not merely spiritually dull, but physically vulnerable. The Cistercian influence ensured that what served military necessity was simultaneously understood as spiritual formation. For the speculative masonry, the lesson transcends the military context. A body unburdened by excess is more capable of the work the craft demands, whether that work is service, prayer, or study. So if the Templar fast served both spiritual and military purposes, does its dual function diminish its spiritual significance or illustrate that all life can be consecrated? How might a modern Mason tune the instrument of the body and mind without the structure of monastic rule? And is there a point at which physical discipline becomes counterproductive to spiritual goals, where the body is weakened beyond usefulness? The Templar fast was extreme. It was bound to a specific historical context and calling. But spiritual ingenuity sometimes discovers creative solutions to apparent contradictions. Sometimes the rule itself demands flexibility in order to remain viable. The Paulaner monks of Bavaria faced such a dilemma during the Lenten observances. They sought to honor their vows while preserving strength necessary for labor and prayer. Their solution offers a fascinating case study in how discipline can adapt without dissolving. In their story, we encounter prudence in action and the virtue that navigates between rigid legalism and lax permissiveness. The story of the Paulaner monks, the Order of Minims, offers a fascinating study in the intersection of temperance and sacrifice. Their unique approach to the Lenten fast illustrates how the spirit finds light even through the most rigorous physical trials, using ingenuity to balance the needs of the body with the demands of the soul. Founded by St. Francis of Paola in the 15th century, the Order of Minims, minim meaning the least, embodied the Masonic virtue of humility. The rule was one of extreme sacrifice, producing a perpetual Lent abstaining from all meat and animal products. In the 17th century, at Neudeck ob der Alkoister in Munich, the monks faced a dilemma. The Lenten fast forbade solid food, yet they needed strength for labor and prayer. Relying on an ancient monastic principle, liquida non frangunta linenium, liquids do not break the fast, they brewed a highly nutritious, calorie-dense beer, today known as Doppelbock, also known as the bread of the soul, originally Sankt Vatbier. And Paulaner Salvator is the modern ancestor of this beer. Well, it has evolved over time. This liquid beer was thick, sweet, and rich in nutrients. The original beer was uncarbonated, heavy, and syrupy. Consuming it exclusively for 40 days was a grueling exercise of monotony, not a celebration of indulgence. Whether we associate the beer today, conviviality, refreshment, and pleasure, the monks' experience was opposite. The liquid beer was sustenance, not enjoyment. There is an article out there from a documentarian that actually went to the monastery and lived there for in excess of 40 days during the Lenten fast. And they described, and they were medically monitored, but they described how they partook of the fast with the monks and followed the monks and mirrored their work. Essentially, it was 3 or 4 beers a day, and you would have one in the morning, one in the around lunchtime, one in the evening. Occasionally, you'd have another on say Sunday. And after 40 days, they seem to be doing pretty good, medically speaking. It's an article worth reading. I'll have to find that. A persistent legend suggests the monks sent a cask to the Pope in Rome for approval. The story goes that the beer soured during the journey over the Alps, and when the Pope tasted the vinegar-like liquid, he declared it so foul it must be a penance, thus granting his blessing. While the story is beloved, no papal document records this event. It serves as a parable of the order's humility and the lengths they went to maintain their vows. Brewing itself, however, is historically documented. The Paulaner brewery's monastic origins are well established, even if the papal legend is not. For the speculative mastery, the Paulaner monks provide a lesson in prudence and fortitude. By the virtue of prudence, they used intellect to create a means of survival that did not violate their vows. They understood that the builder must maintain the temple, the body, even while making sacrifices. And by the virtue of fortitude, they endured the 40-day liquid fast with the focus on their spiritual duties, providing that the mind can rule the body's cravings. They remind us that our journey is often reached through creative discipline. They did not abandon the fast, nor did they starve themselves into inability. They found a middle way that allowed the spirit to remain active while the flesh was subdued. Some questions for reflection and possible discussion if you all want. If the monks found creative solutions to sustain themselves during extreme fasts, does innovation undermine discipline or demonstrate prudence? What distinguishes prudence from expediency when adapting ancient rules to practical necessity? And if a practice born of sacrifice becomes a source of commercial profit, does that validate the original method or betray the original vow? It is worth noting that the order of Mims, when they were in their Lenten fast, any excess that they had in food and crop was given to charity. We have examined charity, sacrifice, and fasting individually, traced their historical embodiments, and witnessed their creative applications. Now comes the crucial task, integrating these three principles into a united spiritual economy. They are not three separate disciplines to be pursued in isolation. They are three movements of a single symphony. Each reinforces the others. Each completes the others. The question remains, how do we weave them into the fabric of daily life, so that they cease to be practices where we perform and become the rhythm by which we breathe? Let us now consider their integration and the transformation it produces. Brethren, these three practices, charity, sacrifice, and fasting, are the three pillars upon which the spiritual life rests. Fasting detaches us from the self and provides internal discipline, temperance. Sacrifice reorients our will toward God, fortitude, and justice. Charity directs our renewed energy towards the neighbor, prudence, and brotherly love. When a Mason practices temperance, he gains the surplus to give in charity. When he gives in charity, he performs a sacrifice of his own resources. This cycle creates a temple of light within his heart. The relationship is not merely sequential, but circular and mutually reinforcing. Without fasting, our charity becomes paternalistic, giving from our excess without feeling the cost. Without sacrifice, our fasting becomes mere self-improvement or vanity. Without charity, our sacrifice becomes a bitter martyr complex exercise. In the volume of Sacred Law, we find the blueprint for this integrated life in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Quote, "What doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." Unquote. To do justly is the result of sacrifice, aligning with God's law. To love mercy is the essence of charity, and to walk humbly is the fruit of fasting, or the subduing of our egos. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus treats these three as a standard rhythm of spiritual life. He does not say, if you give, if you pray, or if you fast, but rather, quote, when you give, when you pray, when you fast, unquote. They are assumed to be the heartbeat of the believer. That was Matthew chapter 6. The ultimate spiritual aspect of these practices is the removal of the veil between the soul and God. St. Augustine famously said, quote, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee," unquote. Charity, sacrifice, and fasting are the tools we use to dismantle the idols of comfort, money, and ego that keep us from that rest. When we give, we break the power of mammon, money. When we sacrifice, we break the power of pride. And when we fast, we break the power of the flesh. We have traced the path from individual practice to integrate discipline, but theory must ultimately yield to summons. This lodge is gathered to hear not merely ideas, but challenges, to leave not with notes in a notebook, but with resolve in the heart. The work before us is not tomorrow's work, it is today's work. What then shall we carry forward from this hour of speculation into the weeks ahead? The answer lies in conclusion. Go ahead, John. You need to unmute, John. I understand, and we got to consider, though, that we're chipping away. We're using that common gavel. And God does not expect us to be, I don't believe God expects us to be perfect. But I believe He expects us to make a reasonable effort. And it takes practice. It takes time to actually build on that. I follow. Unless we have more, I'm going to move right on to the conclusion if everyone's good with that. So, the work, like I was saying, the work before us is not tomorrow's work, it's today's work. What then shall we carry forward from this hour of speculation into the weeks ahead? And the answer does lie in our conclusion. The spiritual life is not an escape from the world, but a deeper engagement with it through the lens of the divine. Charity, sacrifice, and fasting are practical ways that we enact our love for God. They are means by which the image of God within us, marred by selfishness and distraction, is restored to its original luster. One day, brethren, we will be summoned to the celestial lodge above, where the great architect of the universe resides. Whether we understand this as a literal Istological judgment or as the ultimate accountability of conscience, the effect is the same. There will be a reckoning with the quality of our inner work, and in that final inspection, we will not be asked how many degrees we attained or what jewels we wore upon our breasts. We will be asked, did you feed the hungry and clothe the naked? Did you lay aside your own pride for the sake of the truth? Did you master your own nature so the Spirit could lead you? Let us therefore use these spiritual tools with the skill of a master workman. Let us build our inner temples with the gold of charity, the silver of sacrifice, and the precious stones of disciplined spirit. Let us remember that in the apostles' metaphor, the materials matter, but so does the workmanship. Gold, silver, and precious stones represent the highest quality of building but they also avail nothing if laid without skill, without care, and without love. The master workman does not merely select fine materials, he labors over them with patience and devotion, shaping each one to fit its place in the eternal design. So, some questions for reflection. At the Celestial Lodge, will the precision of our ritual matter or the quality of our interior workmanship? If the final inspection focuses on these three virtues, what does this imply about the relative importance of ritual proficiency versus ethical formation in our lodges? And would a brother who excelled in every degree but neglected these three pillars look like before the great architect? Is there any among us who have not been that brother at some point? Brethren, here's my bibliography. And at this time, I'm going to open the floor to any discussion or comments. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our screen for I'm going to add our video screen to the conversation here. If I could make this thing work for me. And there we go. All right. First question we have is from John. Oh, we got two. We've got Nick and John Bishop. Nick, we'll go ahead. Since you got your mic off, we'll go with you. Yes. Oh, Terry's jumping in on this one. We had Pierre, then Bishop, then Jason Nardi. Go ahead, Pierre. Thank you, Pierre. John Bishop. John, you got your mic muted. Thank you, John. Jason. Right on, Jason. Thank you. Brother Ray. Right on, Ray. Thank you. Something I Okay, Nick, I'll get you after myself. It's kind of been holding this one back. One of the reasons I kind of really rolled with this is second degree. We tend to, a lot of lodges tend to do Amos because it's a lot shorter versus doing 1 Corinthians 13. I think that verse, though, out of Corinthians is more beautiful, and I think a more it's more impactful, especially for the contemplative Mason. What kind of gets me is when I look out in the community and I look at what nonprofits are doing what, and I look at things within the corporate world with, we're doing a charity fundraiser, and it's a lot of it. What I see across the spectrum, be it a nonprofit, being corporates or other organizations doing fundraisers, is it's always a lot of self-promotion, a lot of look at us with a big check, look at us giving money away, look at us doing this, that, or the other. And even in a lodge meeting where I hear brothers say, let's be charitable. How about the lodge cuts a check for $1,000 to this initiative? But if you say, well, hold on a second, how's that being charitable? Well, that's us being charitable. I'm like, well, it's the lodges being charitable. I said, why are we not passing the hat? I mean, if you consider that some lodges, may only have, say, $50 a year for dues, and the brother says, well, my $50 covers that charity. Well, does it really? Does it really? What if a lodge said, hey, we're going to go ahead and charge $500 a year for dues, but the lodge is going to go ahead and take, 3/4 of that and put that towards charity? That'd be a different situation. Or what if the lodge said, we're going to pass the hat, or we're going to show up and help Habitat for Humanity build, but we're not going to promote it. The thing I see with a lot of charity is, are we being true to ourselves? Are we taking our worldly reward, our secular reward, and promoting ourselves, saying, hey, look at us? And then, are we going to turn to at the house of the Lord and say we demand payment for our charitable works on the earth that we're now in heaven? Are we going to be met with, well, you received your payment. You received it while you were on the earth. Something that really bothers me is looking at nonprofits, and you see how much money that they, and this is all public record. You could go on the IRS website, look up various nonprofits. You could go on ProPublica, nonprofits that are filing a 990, a full 990. You could actually see a lot. You can see a lot of their books. Take a look at a nonprofit. See what they're actually taking in for. Look at what they're taking in. Look at what they're paying their people. Look at where they're spending the money. And it scares me. I shouldn't say it scares me. It disappoints me because some of these folks truly call themselves charities, and they preach it as charity. They preach it as philanthropy, but it's largely self-serving. Anyway, I'm going to get off the soapbox, and I'm going to turn it over to Nick for his comments. John Bishop. Brother Joe. Brother Joe, you have any more on that? So I think there's, that's where we come in something of an ethical dilemma. If we see someone that's struggling with, say, addiction, opening the window and handing them, $20 is probably going to end up a needle in their arm or something getting stored up their nose. And I think in that aspect, we have social accountability. We have a moral accountability to see that our agape might be used in a manner that's that does more than to be an enabling form of agape. And I think that there's kind of that blind agape where there's really no accountability, and it really serves to enable, I guess you could say, self-destructive behaviors versus that agape that's thoughtful and that finds a way to kind of break through and provide that help. I mean, it's not so much giving the man a fish, but teaching the man how to fish. Whether it be, in this instance, instead of giving the man the fix that he needs to get him along until he needs his next fix, trying to find a way to help that man break the chains of that addiction that enslaves him. Nick. Brother Terry. Kind of sounds like it sounds like they're justifying their delusion. I love it. Well, it's it's an opinion, and you know what they say about opinions. Your truth, my truth, that person's truth across the street. It's an opinion, and you know exactly what they say about opinions. Everyone's got one. And they all stink to be concise. Please. Well, we think about it too. I mean, look at where we've gone with, you know, you used to go sit. You could be a member or an employee of a company for your whole life, your whole adult life, and know that you could make your way through, you know, 20, 30, 40 years of employment and never have to fear about, you know, I guess you could say, greed being put before the well-being of the employee. And now that's just not the case. It's, you know, we've you know, I don't mean to make it sound like a social commentary, but it truly is, because now we got to consider that where are we without, say, you know, without faith to guide us? You have people that are largely educated and know what they're doing, but they're making decisions that I think, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago or longer they would find the society would find appalling, because, you know, they were doing this to basically profit, and it would be at the expense of, you know, it'd be the expense of society, it'd be at the expense of the employees, and it's Jason's right. We've totally lost that, in that, you know, we used to have, you know, people that were educated, but they were also people of faith, people of morals, and we don't really see that anymore. And it's a whole wide spectrum of it. Go ahead, Nick. Yes. Yeah. I follow Nick. So I mean, but it becomes a two-way street. I mean, I think it's not just on the corporate end. It's, you know, the human end as well. It's like, You have a lot of folks that honest to God, believe that, well, I'm entitled to this. It's, I'm entitled, and it's like, well, what have you actually done to merit it? And I follow what you're saying. Um, it goes both ways. There's morality to both sides of it. Oh, here we go. Gotcha. John. John, I think that's probably one of the most powerful questions I've ever heard you ask. It's I could say the same about my career, but your question though framed it put things into perspective for me that I really need to, take into deeper contemplation. And this is this topic is one of those ones that I've really taken to heart. I mean, that's I'm to the point where I am being more mindful of my giving, my charity, um, and fasting has kind of started to become more of a routine for me. But I'm still I'm still working on the sacrifice portion of it. So I want to thank you for that question, because it's really been a lot for me to consider. Um, and I'm going to turn it over to Terry, since he's got his hand up. Yes. Hmm. Nick? Well, there's that. You also got to look at back in that day. Your children were basically your retirement plan. So you sacrifice your child. There goes your security blanket for for when you're old and unable to really do anything for yourself. So there was that, and then of course just your lineage and your sanity. You're gonna sit there and spend the rest of your days suffering with the decision that you made, the sacrifice of that, and just probably losing your mind that you had done such a thing. Anyway, I'm going to turn back to whoever had the floor next. Aha! Now we're really going to get deep. Who's the well, who's to say that we're not living life, but living life in purgatory as we are? Well, I try to kind of think of things from this perspective that try to live a good life, try to live a just life. But I try to think of the things that hardships in life are more or less challenges that are presented by God, challenges that are presented by the Lord to help me grow into to being a better person, to learn and to fit whatever the master plan is. But I also kind of consider perhaps that things are kind of a purgatory that's preparation for the next life. So be it that it be a challenge, or be that this is some sort of purgatory on top of being real life. It's I try to take things that we need to think of the different perspectives that are out there and that could be affecting us. But I try to think of it, what's the Lord preparing me for next, and it's making it a decision that's not just informed, but an ethical and moral and good decision in how I behave and how I act, and it's one of those things where it's like try to do good, always try to do good. But I'll turn it over to whoever had it was up next. I think Nick, you were after Pierre. It can be. It depends on what you aim to accomplish. I mean, you might be one of those things where you're going to abstain from, say, from having meat. You might say, I'm going to pursue strictly vegetarian or pescatarian diet, without, say, red beef or something that lives on the land. But it's a conscious decision on what you're going to fast on and why you're making such a sacrifice. I've actually been doing a lot of fasting. I've been doing intermittent fasting, and about a month ago I did a 72-hour fast. I couldn't have made that 72-hour fast. And I tell you what, there are days I have a hard time with the intermittent fasting. The only thing that really gets me through is prayer. Is absolutely prayer. Or I'm failing when I fail with my sacrifice is that while I'm fasting for reasons of health, and while the Lord is getting me through my fast through prayer and faith, I'm failing I'm failing my covenant with the Lord, and that the money that I save from fasting, I should be taking that and putting it to a cause that needs it, and that's where I'm failing to complete the triangle. Brother Joe. I appreciate that. That's huge because it's. Thank you, brother, for that. I've been off social media for a number of years. I believe Brother Nick has as well. And that's a great perspective to put it into, because before with the Facebook stuff, I mean, you're right. That algorithm keeps us kind of busy, and it creates a lot of noise, I guess you could say, in our life. And by fasting and abstaining from it, it allows us to actually hear the individual, to hear truth, to see people for being people, not fodder for the algorithm to inspire us to hate one another and tear each other down. I love that. Yep. Hmm. Well, I think you got to kind of look at Maslow's hierarchy before you can even start to address some of this other stuff. If you don't have that hierarchy fulfilled, you're doomed to being in a place without having all those dimensions kind of covered, that you really can't. You're going to have a hard time. I shouldn't say you can't. You're going to have a hard time engaging in the pursuit of the spirit. Granted, we're up here in Alaska, and if I'm without food, if I'm without shelter, I could fell some trees, and then I could, take off after, go fishing or take off after a moose or whatever to meet those needs. But I'm going to be focused on all that other stuff, and perhaps, I'm going to sit down and be like, man, I really suck as a hunter. I really suck at fishing, or I'm struggling to build this cabin. Maybe I need to step away from it and pray for help. So, anyway. But we got Joe, then Nick. It does actually. You make a good point. It's if a forced fast would not really be called a forced fast. I would consider that hardship. Go ahead, Nick. Um, Let me kind of hit on that real quick, Nick. So you'll have hardship where you are without certain things that would help you realize that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But with a fast, you're making a conscious decision to deprive yourself of certain things within that hierarchy of needs. And it's not so much that with Maslow, he's talking about an actualization that's more of, I guess you could say, a secular way of actualization. With spiritual, with fasting, you're removing certain things from your life. And I'm not talking like abstinence from, say, video games or pornography or that kind of stuff. We know we might consider those under vices and superfluities, things that we probably should remove in order to live a healthier life. We're talking about you're removing some of your base needs, the things that you need really to get by in life, to actually make you feel full, to make you feel, I'm not hungry. You're removing a base need. But you're removing that base need, and in this case, a fast is a way of removing food to actually help, to cause you to get that hunger, but that hunger you're actually using to listen for God. And you're going to need God to get you through that fast. following in the example of Christ over his 40 days and nights and the temptations that he experienced during that time. So that's really where that comes from. I think we had Terry, then Pierre. So the way I look at Maslow is, you have that old game, The Sims, where if the sim wasn't fed, if the sim didn't have enough entertainment to be happy, didn't have enough social interaction to be happy, wasn't able to take a shower, wasn't able to get good sleep, their bars wouldn't be high, and then they would go to the job and they would have a really bad day on the job, or they'd lose their job because they didn't meet all of Maslow's needs for the hierarchy. So but in that case, it's all secular. It's all very worldly. It's all very material. Is what that's about. So it's about actually realizing your full potential, that you could do, for lack of a better term, to put aside some money for retirement and to pay your taxes. In this case, what we're doing is we're finding ways to push pause on the material world, so we could let in the voice of the spiritual world, let in the light of the spiritual world into our own lives, and to gain deeper insights and connection with our Creator. Nick. You're muted, Nick. Oh, I don't know. I did say Nick. It's all good. So may I, Nick? So I appreciate what Maslow has to say, and without looking at the pyramid or Maslow's hierarchy, I you know, I missed a lot of that. So you make a good point with the transcendence, and you got to realize that if you have the ability to actually sit down and think about charity, fasting, and sacrifice, it means that you already have abundance. You already have met all kinds of needs. You're in a good place. So we're in a position ourselves where we are blessed. We just don't realize the blessings that we have. I think I for one I think about it. Well, I have more than what most people in this world have. So am I able to forgo, 2 meals a day, limit myself to 1 meal a day, or better yet, forgo a whole day or two without meals, and then I could turn around and actually take that and give it to the poor, or provide it to a food bank, or provide it to say a religious social services that's going to feed the poor, clothe the poor. Do I go through my closet and say I have more than what I could possibly need? I'm going to go ahead and take this down to the local shelter, or take this to the local social services. Brother Ray, thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend. So you know what, you're right. Maslow, we can incorporate Maslow into that. However, for some of us, sometimes what we need is a reminder. So I think back to when Cecilia and I were struggling in Maryland, and at one point, the economy had taken a downturn. I had been injured at work, and we had to decide whether we were going to pay our mortgage or eat. And this is one of those situations where I think back to it and I think, wow, man, that was 20 years ago. That was 20 years ago. What the heck? How far have we come? And I think that in practice, it's to remind you of the hardship of those in need, those that are doing without, those that are going to bed cold and hungry. If we've never experienced those feelings for ourselves, perhaps it's time to actually do that. So yeah, I'm not trying to sound like some self-righteous prick. It's just, oh my God, you need to starve yourselves to understand what it feels like. No, it's meant to be a spiritual exercise. It's meant to get you in touch with God, but it's meant to allegorically put you in other people's shoes. So, yes, you could walk the spiritual path, charity, sacrifice, and fasting, or you could take Maslow for the full ride, and through your self-actualization, you realize how good you truly do have it, and say to yourself, do I really need all these hookers and blow around me? Or can I go ahead and convert some of this stuff into cash and take it down to a local food bank and spread the wealth? And I'm sorry for the crass analogy. That's me making a bad joke. Brother Joe. Oh, Brother John. Brother Joe, back to you. I appreciate that, brother. Yeah. How's everyone doing out there? It's been a good feast for the soul today. I love you all, brothers, and I really appreciate having you all here. well, I look forward to this. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Pierre. Well, thank you. I've made a conscious decision that that ALB is kind of going to be one of my big focuses going forth with my Masonic life, my Masonic journey. But more or less stepping away from a lot of the, I guess you could say, the secularized side of Freemasonry, the organizational aspects of it, to focus on the spiritual pursuits. And I am very, very blessed to have all you brothers here with me today, this morning, taking the time to listen to me, to discuss this stuff with me, because I learn a lot from listening to you guys. So I just want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I look forward to rolling forward with some more spiritual stuff here in the future, and try and get us all kind of engaged. And every time I look at this paper, and it's become kind of at least a weekly exercise to read it, really makes me think about my life and the life that I'm leading, and the changes I need to continue to make in myself. Thank you, Brother Terry. Amen to that. Well, brothers, does anyone have anything else to add? Or any more questions or anything to bring up to keep this thing rolling? Have a great weekend, brother. Thank you. Thank you all, brothers. Thank you very much. Good seeing you all, brothers. Have a great weekend. All right, John, I'll be here.